It's the picture of the Gulf War you've undoubtedly seen. A road strewn with hundreds of burnt-out vehicles, corpses litter the landscape as the husks of hulking tracks and sleek cars met their fiery demise all the same. What on earth happens here to cause so much destruction? How is one man's greed all the reason behind it? And how did a coalition of over 30 nations come together to help a friend in need with overwhelming firepower and extreme prejudice? Well, today we're going to find out as we look back on perhaps the most brutal and certainly one of the most controversial events of the Gulf War. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Turns out it's paved with Iraqi military vehicles and American taxpayer dollars. On one fateful day in 1990, it was the worst road in the world to travel on. Highway 80, otherwise known as the Highway of Death. Now, before we get into the event itself, we must first understand the context in which this one-sided battle was ultimately fought. And for that, we have to travel back over 3 decades. Come along for the ride until the wheels come off, because you don't want to miss this one. It was the 1990s, the era of change. The Soviet Union would collapse, Beanie Babies would become popular for some reason, and Jinko jeans were all the rage. However, the more things change in the world culturally, the more they seem to stay the same in the world of warfare. Countries still invade others, fight brutal wars, subjugate civilians, and commit atrocities. The 90s would become known for such crimes, and a little Iraqi dictator known as Saddam Hussein would ensure that the decade literally went off with a bang. On the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam Hussein's forces crossed the border into Kuwait. Iraq had invaded Kuwait to cancel a large debt it owed the nation and to seize Kuwaiti oil reserves. Being the only major highway that formally connects the two nations, Saddam used Highway 80, where the focus of this story will take place. Highway 80 is a large highway running from the capital of Kuwait City all the way to the Iraqi city of Basra via the town of Safwan. At 6 lanes wide, the road was perfect for efficiently moving large quantities of soldiers, vehicles, and equipment. This is something that we like to call foreshadowing. Highway 80 was only 172 kilometers long, 106 miles for those of you using freedom units. Driving the full length of the highway from Basra to Kuwait City takes less than 2.5 hours. It effectively provided an arrow pointing right at the heart of Kuwait's capital city that in 1990 the Iraq military convoy raced towards. Kuwait is the much smaller nation with a much smaller army and did not stand a chance in a one-on-one fight. However, Kuwait had some friends in rather powerful places. As a major oil producer with Western military bases within its borders, Kuwait was allied with many nations, including those on the UN Security Council. So, Kuwait called his uncle, Uncle Sam. The outrage in the wake of Saddam's invasion was palpable, and the international community at large was not happy. As such, the invasion was largely criticized on the world stage. Getting the Soviets, European Union, NATO, Arab League, and the US to agree on anything in 1990 was pretty difficult, but they all agreed on this: Saddam had messed up big time. The United Nations passed a series of resolutions, ultimately culminating in UN Security Council Resolution 678, demanding that Iraqi forces withdraw immediately and unconditionally from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. Failing to do so, the UN would authorize the use of force to expel Saddam's forces from the country. Saddam ignored this ultimatum. The Iraqi army was determined to stay and fight rather than pull out. So, when the deadline of the 15th of January came and went with no withdrawal, a coalition of 35 nations sprang into action to restore peace. It must be said just how much of a collaborative international effort this was. The term coalition often brings images to mind of the joint US-UK coalition that invaded Iraq in 2003, but this coalition was truly enormous, and it needed to be in order to combat the 4th largest army on Earth at the time. It's also worth saying that this was not a coalition solely made up of Western nations. In no particular order, the US, UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Canada, Australia, Argentina, Italy, Spain, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Greece, Portugal, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Morocco, Senegal, Niger, Bangladesh, Pakistan, New Zealand, South Korea, Hungary, and Thailand. Deep breath! They all got involved. And these were just the nations that sent troops, with the likes of Japan and other nations contributing heavily to the international effort in other ways. It was like that final scene of Avengers Endgame. The reason we've just listed all those countries is that it's important to recognize that there was a collective responsibility for the events to come. This was not the US, and if you're their mates, versus Iraq. It was a concerted effort by the international community to overturn a war of aggression waged by a dictator with expansionist ambitions. The coalition was going to put Iraq back in its box, though this would turn out to be somewhat of an understatement. In the opening 24 hours of the infamous Operation Desert Storm, the BBC reports that over 1,000 sorties were flown. The campaign of shock and awe that followed was like a hammer crashing through a pane of glass. The Iraqi army was totally destroyed by the coalition's air superiority. Now, Iraqi troop casualty data is surprisingly difficult to find, and differing sources' estimations vary wildly. The National Army Museum places the number of Iraqi soldiers killed at 30,000, but some estimates put the number as high as 100,000, or maybe even higher than that. Even with the conservative 30,000 estimate, for a war that lasted less than 7 months, this is an astonishing amount of bloodshed. This is whilst, according to the British Legion, less than 400 coalition troops died in total. That is to say that the Iraqi army was getting their lunch money taken. When Saddam realized the defeat was inevitable in the face of overwhelming fire superiority, he finally decided to retreat. But the Iraqi army did not simply withdraw. They adopted a scorched earth policy as they did so. In short, this is a military tactic that involves destroying anything and everything that could help an enemy recover from a war. In total, Saddam's armies set light to over 700 Kuwaiti oil wells, and the ensuing fires burned for 10 months. But the Iraqi army's brutality was not limited to Kuwait's oil infrastructure. Human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reported on an extensive Iraqi campaign of abuses towards Kuwaiti citizens, including torture, disappearances, executions, theft, and sexual assaults. In a documentary on the Gulf War, General Buster Glosson, director of the Air Force campaign plan, stated that, quote, "The Iraqis that were in Kuwait, from the top person to the lowest person, were the most brutal individuals that society has had to deal with since World War II. It was reported by the New York Times that hundreds and potentially thousands of Kuwaitis were taken by Iraqi forces back to Iraq, many in the final hours before the army fled. Raed al-Musa, a Kuwaiti father, was quoted as saying, "A lot of people have disappeared in Iraq and never been seen since." He continued, "My son is missing, and I worry he may never come back." So the situation on the ground was as follows. The air campaign was seeing roaring success, with the coalition forces having gained total air superiority over Saddam's troops. The Iraqi army, having invaded a peaceful neighbor for its own gain, were now in full flight, leaving a trail of destruction behind them as their scorched earth policy literally left Kuwait burning. The Iraqi army had conducted a brutal campaign of human rights abuses on the civilian population and now were hightailing it back to the border. They were not only fleeing all at once, but in the exact same direction on the only major highway that connected the two countries and that it had previously used in its initial invasion, Highway 80. And the coalition knew exactly where they were. General Glosson stated that he called General David Bull Baker of the US Air Force and told him the following, quoting, "I want you to get 12 air crews, and I want you to personally take them to the airplane. Tell them they only have to do one thing. Go to Kuwait City, go north on Highway 6, a road surrounding Kuwait City connected to Highway 80, and stop the convoy." Saddam Hussein was about to learn what scorched earth really meant. On February the 27th, 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf, the Commander-in-Chief of United States Central Command and leader of the coalition forces in the Gulf Theater, ordered a massive aerial bombardment of the fleeing army. Now, this might sound at first like a mistake. The army was fleeing. Surely the war was won. There was no need to attack the army as they left Kuwait. They posed no threat to anyone at this point. However, the soldiers were fleeing in their trucks and taking their equipment back to Iraq. The coalition did not want Saddam's forces to be able to reuse these tanks, missile launchers, trucks, and more in the future. General Schwarzkopf himself said as much in an interview with PBS, quoting here, "The first reason why we bombed the highway coming out of Kuwait is because there was a great deal of military equipment on that highway. And again, I had given orders to all my commanders that I wanted every piece of Iraqi equipment that we possibly could destroyed. Because if we destroyed that Iraqi military equipment, that was equipment that would not be around for them to use later on." General Chuck Horner, the coalition Air Force commander at the time, had a similar sentiment. In a story he told to a documentary crew, he said, "The head of the Kuwaiti underground called me and said, 'They're leaving.' He was crying. I started crying. And then we said, we need to stop this exodus, because this was military capability which may be turned around and brought back into play in a few years. This made the fleeing column of vehicles a justified military target for the coalition in their rules of engagement. The coalition took full advantage of this fact, and the results were absolutely devastating for the fleeing Iraqi army. Coalition aircraft made up of F-15E fighter jets, A-10s, and attack helicopters repeatedly strafed the 2-mile-long convoy on the highway. They began by attacking the vehicles at the front and back of the convoy, which effectively stopped many of the vehicles in their tracks and left them trapped. The remaining vehicles in the middle of the convoy were sitting ducks. Over the course of the next several hours, coalition aircraft systematically and methodically blew up every single vehicle on Highway 80. While some Iraqi vehicles did get past the initial convoy and the ensuing barrage, they were systematically hounded by Apache helicopters as they sped back to the border. Even when reaching Iraq itself, the coalition forces continued to deal damage to remaining Iraqi vehicles and equipment. They wanted to make sure that Saddam could not pull this stunt again in the future. The Atlantic reports that a large number of Kuwaiti civilian vehicles were destroyed in the attack. At first, it was feared that this could have been a significant number of Kuwaiti civilians fleeing the capital. However, it later came to light that the large number of civilian vehicles on the highway were in fact stolen by Iraqi soldiers as they fled back to Iraq. General Schwarzkopf, in his PBS interview, is quoted as saying, "Just about every vehicle that they were fleeing in was a vehicle that they had stolen from Kuwait." Time magazine indicates a wide variety of vehicles were later discovered amongst the wreckage, including milk vans, fire trucks, limousines, and one bulldozer to go alongside the trucks, armored cars, and tanks. The Atlantic lends credence to the idea that the vehicles were stolen, as it reported that many vehicles held fully loaded but rusting Kalashnikov variants in them. It would also not make logical sense for Kuwaitis fleeing the conflict to travel north towards Iraq instead of south toward coalition partner Saudi Arabia. Now, it's important to note that undoubtedly a number of civilians may have been killed in the strike, as the Iraqi army had taken hostages in the final hours before their retreat. However, understanding what that number is very difficult to determine. Almost every single vehicle on Highway 80 that day was destroyed and left as a smouldering husk in the middle of the desert. Estimations for the total number of vehicles destroyed range from just over 1,000 all the way up to 2,700. So many vehicles were destroyed that troops in country referred to the event as a turkey shoot. But it is the number of deaths that is the most contentious thing about all of this. The true number of those killed that day is difficult to determine, with reports ranging from a few hundred to tens of thousands. The BBC falls in the middle, placing the number of Iraqi soldiers killed in the low thousands. The sheer level of destruction on Highway 80 and the ensuing photos that would emerge would indicate a high number of casualties. However, in destroying the front and back of the convoy and leaving a large number of the vehicles trapped by the ensuing traffic jam, it is now commonly thought that many Iraqi soldiers abandoned their vehicles to avoid being strafed by coalition aircraft. General Walt Boomer, commander of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, was quoted as saying, "There were some Iraqis who were killed, but I was there at the point when the Iraqi truck engines were still running. Nobody in them, but the engine was running." So they weren't stupid. They had seen air coming down the column, and then they'd bailed out and escaped over in the marsh and ultimately made their way back into Iraq. Both the Foreign Policy Research Institute and Time magazine corroborate General Boomer's story, stating that post-war studies found that most of the wrecks had been abandoned before they were strafed. Whilst casualties were found, including trucks and cars with burned bodies inside, many of the occupants had fled on foot. Time magazine further states that the fleeing troops on foot were not fired upon by the coalition aircraft. Not only is this consistent with the various general stories about needing to destroy the equipment and vehicles as a primary target, it would also paint the coalition in a more favorable light by sticking to the rules of engagement. Not every military force is quite so disciplined as the Kuwaitis had just learned. This wasn't out of the goodness of the coalition's hearts, mind you. The mission was complete, the convoy was destroyed, and Iraqi soldiers were taken out of the fight. For those soldiers left behind as their vehicles were left burning, though, I'm sure it didn't feel like much of a mercy. The Iraqi army was stranded on foot, potentially dozens of miles from the border with no food or water. Eventually, many would limp back across the border into Iraq after days of walking. The destruction was still absolutely devastating all the same. The Washington Post interviewed an Iraqi soldier in 1993 who was present during the attack on Highway 80. He paints a different picture than the more surgical, sanitized general's accounts, quoting here, "There were hundreds of cars destroyed, soldiers screaming. It was nighttime as the bombs fell, lighting up charred cars, bodies on the side of the road, and soldiers sprawled on the ground, hit by cluster bombs as they tried to escape from their vehicles. I saw hundreds of soldiers like this, but my main target was to reach Basra. We arrived on foot. The photos that would emerge in the immediate aftermath of the Highway of Death incident were truly shocking, showing miles of burned out vehicle husks. It was as devastating and brutal as it was impersonal. It was modern warfare personified. But was it really? The main pictures that came out after the Highway 80 attack showed columns of vehicles destroyed, as well as equipment and debris. But people had died here, in particularly gruesome ways too, and that message didn't always make it back to coalition newspapers. It was a very sanitized idea of warfare that was being filtered through to international news media. The pictures showed a bunch of blown up vehicles, a lot of destruction, yeah, but not the true cost of war. A war correspondent, Kenneth Jarecki, who was on the ground in the immediate aftermath of the attack, took a particularly harrowing picture of a man climbing out of a vehicle who had been charred alive. This ran counter to the idea that this was a sanitized video game war, a conflict rendered entirely humane through precision bombing and night vision equipment. In the US, the picture was deemed so nasty that the Associated Press's New York City officers pulled the photo entirely from the wire service, keeping it off the desks of virtually all of America's newspaper editors. It is unknown precisely how, why, or by whom the AP's decision was handed down. The graphic photo was published in the British newspaper The Observer, as well as a French daily publication, Libération, and these were the only two major news outlets that ran the photo at the time. Eventually, the photo would find its way to the US at a later date, but the already sanitized nature of the conflict had set in. Tony McGrath was the picture editor for The Observer at the time the infamous picture was published. In an interview with The Atlantic, he said the following: "There were 1,400 Iraqi soldiers in that convoy, and every picture transmitted until that one came 2 days after the event was of debris, bits of equipment. No human involvement at all. It could have been a scrapyard." That was some dreadful censorship. Even Jarecki, who took the photo, was angry too. Not because his photo wasn't in the papers, but because of the principle and what it meant for news media as it relates to war, especially in the United States. Speaking to American Photo in 1991, he summed up the issue by saying, "If we're big enough to fight a war, we should be big enough to look at it." The Gulf War officially ended the day after the attack on the 27th of February 1991 with a temporary ceasefire that was eventually made permanent in April of that same year. The Highway of Death incident actually helped formally end the Gulf War in more ways than one. Whilst the major destruction of an enormous amount of Iraqi equipment and vehicles will have certainly brought Saddam to the negotiating table, the coverage of the Highway of Death incident might have done the same in the US from a PR perspective. A man by the name of Colin Powell, yes, that Colin Powell, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, the highest military position in the Department of Defense. According to the American government's Gulf War Air Power Survey, Chairman Powell told General Schwarzkopf after the Highway of Death incident that there needs to be a ceasefire declared soon, as the White House, under President George Bush Sr., was growing nervous over the media's depiction of the event. Sanitized as it was, it was still devastating. In his autobiography, My American Journey, Powell wrote, "The television coverage was starting to make it look as if we were engaged in slaughter for slaughter's sake." Chairman Powell would go on to become National Security Advisor under the administration of President Bush's son, George W. Bush, 10 years later, when that administration was part of another smaller coalition going to war with Iraq. And which road did they use to stage the invasion? That's right, Highway 80. So, what can we make of all of this? What messages, lessons, and legacy does the Highway of Death leave behind? Well, undoubtedly it's a controversial one. It was arguably the most controversial event of the entire Gulf War, certainly from the coalition side. The coalition forces maintained that the attack was a legitimate military action against legitimate military targets. However, many critics at the time argued that the attack violated the laws of war in failing to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Similarly, the attack was criticized by its detractors for its lack of proportionality, believing that the coalition did not use a reasonable level of force when destroying the convoy. Those in the coalition military forces, however, will have a different view. What were the coalition forces to do? That equipment may well have been used for military purposes later down the line. Were they supposed to meet the Iraqi army head-on? That would likely only incur more casualties. Looking objectively at the situation, the coalition forces did the best that they could to minimize the number of casualties. It may have been heavy-handed, but any Air Force commander will tell you that it's almost impossible to wage war proportionately when you have air superiority. The coalition forces could have mowed down the fleeing Iraqi troops on foot. They could have blown up every single vehicle with their occupants still inside. Instead, they stopped the convoy, destroyed the vehicles to sufficiently neuter the Iraqi forces, and no more. When you look at it that way, it is the definition of proportional. General Buster Glosson had this to say on the matter, quoting, "They had created a sense that we were beating up on these Iraqis who were simply trying to flee the battlefield. It did not convey the sense about defanging the Iraqis sufficiently so that they stay in their box for at least 10 years. So I had no problem with what we did from the so-called Highway of Death." An unnamed Iraqi sniper speaking to a documentary crew gave a different view, stating, "That was the most horrible scene I've ever seen in my life. All you could see was destroyed equipment and corpses. A few meters away from me, there was a tank still covered with corpses, still freshly killed. Their blood was dripping. The whole tank was covered with corpses and blood." Some, like General Schwarzkopf, made the argument that this level of force was justified given the atrocities that the Iraqi army had committed in Kuwait. In an interview with PBS, he clearly frames the operation as a righteous one, stating, quote, "This was not a bunch of innocent people just trying to make their way back across the border to Iraq. This was a bunch of murderers and thugs who had and pillaged downtown Kuwait City and now were trying to get out of the country before they were caught." Some who are more hawkish may argue that the coalition forces did not go far enough given the abuses committed on the Kuwaiti people, but an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And who's right? Well, who knows? I'm certainly no judge to decide one way or the other. I just make YouTube videos. But the Highway of Death is nonetheless a complex topic that brings up a lot of difficult questions that societies at war have to face. What level of force is acceptable on an army if that army is known to have committed war crimes? How does one reconcile air superiority, technical superiority, and overwhelming firepower with the concept of proportionality? How should the international community deal with wars of unjustified aggression? And maybe, most importantly of all, how do our wars today shape the wars of tomorrow? The Gulf War undoubtedly had an effect on how the USA and its coalition partners were viewed on the global stage. One man in particular was watching the actions of the coalition very closely indeed. He would have seen the Highway of Death incident in the news, and he wasn't very pleased. The man's name? Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, of course, being the notorious and now dead terrorist who orchestrated the 9/11 attacks over a decade later. The Gulf War was a turning point for bin Laden, who saw the stationing of foreign troops in Saudi Arabia, the land of the two holiest sites in Islam, as an affront to the principles of Islam itself. He was angry at the Saudi government for allowing coalition forces to station troops there, believing that Muslims should be self-reliant, protecting their own lands from the infidels. These factors, alongside a growing anti-American sentiment owing to the US's operations in the Islamic world, led to him issuing a fatwa in 1994 declaring a jihad on the USA. He would go on to establish the terror cell Al-Qaeda, leading to that fateful day in 2001 when the Twin Towers fell. The Gulf War is a sliding doors moment for the US in the Middle East. They didn't know it at the time, but the coalition's decision to bomb Highway 80 would have more far-reaching consequences than anyone could have ever imagined. When you bomb people, you make enemies, and eventually, they might strike back where you least expect it. And what of Highway 80 today? Well, the US and Kuwaiti forces worked together to repair the highway after the attack, removing wreckages and unexploded ordnance from the road. It was used again to invade Iraq all over again just a decade later. The highway is still there to this day, and it still functions just as any regular highway would, taking non-military vehicles north of Kuwait towards Basra. And if it weren't for Saddam Hussein, it is unlikely that most outside of Kuwait or Iraq would ever have even heard of it. The Highway of Death clearly has a legacy of sorts. It has a legacy dipped in popular culture, with Call of Duty's 2019 installment of their Modern Warfare series featuring a mission in the game with the same name, and it too has a smattering of wrecked vehicles mangled by explosions. However, that game's story takes place in a fictional version of Syria rather than Kuwait. However, its legacy is about more than just video games. The Highway of Death has a legacy of American power projection and its far-reaching consequences. It also has a legacy of tragedy. The Gulf War only started because of one tyrant's greed, bringing untold suffering, death, and destruction to people not just in the country he invaded, but in his own. Innocent men, women, and children who didn't have to die found themselves on the receiving end of some of the worst human rights abuses in a decade that became known for such atrocities. And on top of it all, the Kuwaiti civilians who were kidnapped by the fleeing Iraqis who suffered the same fate as the soldiers on Highway 80 is the biggest tragedy of all. It shows that no matter how precise or how smart your munitions, no matter how righteous your cause, and no matter how good your intentions, war is hell, and it would be good for us all to remember that. Thank you for watching.